So Ben, thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today about the USGBC and your work.
Thank you, Duke. Really happy to be here. Appreciate the time.
So I was in New York last week at the Urban Land Institute's annual meeting, and on the concluding day, they had a special session on urban resilience. And I've got to tell you, for an organization dedicated, as you would know, to the development and construction industry, I was heartened to see how many people came to this session really genuinely concerned about how they can be doing more with regard to topics that you care a lot about. So it seems like a good time for your work and for the USGBC. So before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what you did before your current activities, which has to do with LACI, or the LA Clean Tech Incubator, and maybe how that helps inform some of the things you're doing now. So talk to us a little bit about LACI and the Lacrette's Innovation Campus.
I've been a long-time believer and advocate of the power of really, what some people might call it entrepreneurial, environmental entrepreneurism, or social impact, but really designing business models and investments, projects in ways that are designed to create positive social impacts and have underlying good business principles, so they're able to continue to exist and grow in our capitalistic society, be it what it may. So actually, my journey for the LA Clean Tech Incubator really started with my application to business school, probably back in 2005. Which seems like a long time ago now. My essay for business school, my entrance essay, was all about creating what would now be called a social impact firm, essentially creating businesses that were designed through their business models to generate revenue and make the world a better place. And that was something I really believed in. And then during my time in business school, my final project there was a media and technology co-working space where it had like shared green screens and podcast studio. Speaking of podcasts, we're on one today. And I actually pitched that to the Tech Coast Angels and had a whole business plan and made some good headway, and then sort of decided it wasn't the right time for me and wasn't the right project. And I started a clean tech practice group at my real estate firm, JLL. And through that clean tech practice group, I was kind of the weird green real estate guy. I worked on site selection for rooftop solar, for biofuel facilities, battery manufacturing plants, all kinds of weird real estate deals. But I met the two co-founders of the Clean Tech Incubator. They were putting together an RFP response for the city of LA around just the potential of creating a clean tech incubator. And so we had a meeting, and I'll just never forget this because I was like, "Hey, this sounds amazing. I grew up here in LA. Would love to see this happen. I had this business model I used for this media technology incubator. Maybe we could use that for the clean tech incubator." They're like, "Oh, that sounds great." So we updated my financial model and a bunch of stuff. I ended up working with the co-founders on their RFP response. They ended up winning. And then they slowly sucked me in more and more over time. I worked for probably 2 years for free on the development of the Lacrette's campus in downtown. And eventually I told the team, I was like, "Look, you guys really need to start paying somebody. This is a lot of work." And they said, "Okay, can we pay you?" And I was like, "Sure, that's fine." And so that was just really an amazing journey for me. I met so many great people and had the opportunity to really build a community in the Lacrette's Innovation Campus, and it was amazing to help build the community there. And at one point, I ran kind of everything that was programs and revenue facing on the LACI side, and then I ran operations and finance in my last year and a half there before I came here.
So explain for our listeners the kind of companies or startups that would be in a clean tech incubator.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, at the end of the day, it's anything that really is going to help reduce resource use in a particular sector, right? Clean technology. And so in my time at LACI, I probably worked with over 90 different startups. We had companies that were, in fashion. We had companies that were in material products. Repurpose is one of the companies that's done fairly well in our portfolio. You can find them at Target now or at other places, but they make compostable cupware. We had companies that did different kinds of solar solutions, different elements of maybe solar development projects. We had companies that produce energy from waves, right? So it's really a diverse range. I've always been a big believer personally in businesses that cash flow and not needing to be a huge business. It could be a small business that makes money. And, if it supports 10 people, 15, 20 people, that can be a really viable clean tech company. I think sometimes these days we get caught up in these, everyone wants a unicorn and the investment pitch of it. But we focused on businesses that we thought could, create real job opportunities for people and, help make their communities better. And I think Lacey's done a good job of continuing to honor that and looking at how to diversify the entrepreneurship pipeline, which is a big issue.
So with that as your background, you step into the USGBC, or US Green Building Council, for those who don't know the acronym, and you've been doing that within LA. And then more recently, you've expanded the USGBC from LA, organizationally anyway, to cover all of California, and thus uniting the various chapters or local councils together. Tell us, first of all, just a little bit about the USGBC in LA, if not nationally, and then the advantage and what you think you'll be able to do by rallying all of the California assets into one unit.
Well, there's a lot in those questions, and a lot of things I've been thinking quite a bit about. First of all, the U.S. Green Building Council has been really a leader now for almost 30 years in really leading in building design, building operation. Most people are familiar with LEED, which is leadership in environmental engineering and design. And buildings have certifications. People get certifications from that. That is still the most widely used certification globally in the sustainability space overall, and has really created a lot of positive change. USGBC was LA, now California, as of a week ago, so this is very present. We're an independent nonprofit, so we're affiliated with the U.S. Green Building Council. Our organization is really focused on direct community engagement, on education, on doing what we can on a grassroots, boots on the ground level to help move the market forward. And I really came here, a little bit more than 5 years ago now, because I'm kind of a sustainability journalist, but I'm a green building nerd at heart. I'm really a big believer that buildings offer us a profound opportunity to have a centralized location that has impacts around energy, water, waste, health, but something very tangible we can work on. I think we get a little lost in sustainability jargon and acronyms these days, but the green building community has been finding ways to create these positive impacts around these issues for decades now, and we can really lean into that. And so I saw the opportunity to come here and really unify the green building community first in the LA area, and then now statewide. We've brought 7 different green building communities statewide together under one entity, which was no small thing. It's been a lot of work over the last 9 months or so, but provides this opportunity for California. I mean, California has been a leader, obviously, in the green space, at least here nationally. You can always argue that we could do more when it compares to what some of our friends are doing globally. But at the same time, I'm a big believer that California has a lot of the challenges when it comes to climate change. So water scarcity, which I know we'll talk about later, air quality, heat. A lot of cities experience this. A lot of different regions experience this. But here in California, we've got a lot of the intellectual capital, a lot of financial capital. We've got the political alignment, more or less, to help try to address some of these issues to move it forward. I'm also a big believer that we've got these urban and suburban environments. We've got the largest port in the U.S. We've actually got the largest manufacturing base in the U.S. People don't think about that, but actually the L.A. region is the largest manufacturing base. We can use these different assets to figure out how can we solve challenges, and then we have over, I believe the number is close to 80 different ethnicities. The largest population outside of their home country is in California. What a great opportunity to leverage those connections to different communities around the world to export solutions out. So that's why I saw this opportunity. I mean, like the impacts of climate change continue to increase for us. California's experiences, but I think we have a profound opportunity and responsibility to help try to solve those challenges and lead all those challenges here in California. And so that's part of why we put this together.
Well, one of the ways to think about scale is not at the building level, but at the city level, which I know you do. And I'm particularly interested in the role of cities and institutions and how they come together for mutually beneficial outcomes. And I'm about to speak with Abram Lusgard, and you may know his book On the Move, which describes how people are going to be moving towards cities as climate change might force them away from certain areas where they currently live. This is both a national and international issue. The cities are going to become yet more important than they already are. you are looking closely at them as a potential place to really focus in your decarbonization efforts. So, talk to me about decarbonization and cities where you really can operate at scale.
It's a great question and really important. It's funny. I actually took my kids yesterday to the California Science Center, and there's an IMAX movie on the future of cities that was produced with the American Institute of Civil Engineers.
Mm-hmm.
And There's a guy I used to work with at the mayor's office who was one of the folks in the video, Paul Lee, who's a civil engineer. But they talked with kids and went around the world and looked at cities like looked at Singapore and looked at the Netherlands and Amsterdam, looked at these different examples of cities and how does that prepare us for the future. I think that some of the things we need to think about are, how do we continue to kind of layer these different microcosms, right? So, we're talking a little bit about architects, right? And they're designing a building. Well, that building fits into a larger community,
Mm-hmm.
right? How does that community connect, with everything else? It's very difficult to go to an architect and say, "Hey, architect, please think about your building, the context of this whole community." It's like, hey, I've got a job to do. I got to build this building. And we have planners, right, who think about communities, but maybe have sometimes little opportunity to connect specific buildings. And so I think that we have to start thinking about how do these microcosms connect with each other. And if we hold buildings accountable to try to be, net zero, right, or to even maybe have a positive impact on their environment, and they can try to do that within the context of that building, and then you're able to stitch those together across different communities, you can start to create these threads. I think some of the things that we're battling with right now is that we know, look, we're making a big push for electrification because we know our grids are moving to more clean energy. And how do we bring everyone along with that? And how do we handle bigger loads, as we, bring EVs online or charging for buses and trucks. And so there's all these elements that are in play, and it becomes very overwhelming very quickly. And that's why I think we need to figure out, okay, what are these small elements, which is, again, another reason why I like green buildings, that we focus on. If we focus on the building level, focus on the community level, and the city level, how these things interact with each other. So I don't know if I'm quite answering your question, but I think it's important we think about how these different levels intersect.
Well, you are, because the responsibility is shared, which is pretty much what you're talking about. And we maybe I allowed us to get off on a slight tangent around architects, but mayors seem to be leaders in this space because cities seem to have a lot of leaders who care passionately about this and have the levers that they can operate to help make a difference. That's harder maybe at the state level, and obviously we've seen it's been a challenge at the federal level. At the community level, you see a different aspect. So engineers, architects, planners, landscape architects, it is a very much a complicated quilt of responsibilities, which is what I think you're pointing out. And maybe the reason why the USGBC is needed is that glue that pulls things together, not around just one project, but around bigger ideas. That's sort of what I hear in your answers. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that does make sense. And I think, I think it's difficult, as I said, having worked in the space for a long time, we get pulled in 1,000 different directions, right? Well, we got to solve these 100 different crises. I don't know, can I say crises? Is that the plural of crisis? Yeah,
It works on this show. It works.
But we need something that's manageable, right? At the end of the day, we're all people, right? And climate change is something that's very overwhelming and difficult to connect with. But we can connect with our immediate environment, right? We can connect with, where do I spend my time? How does that impact my health? And so I think if you ask people to consider that, and I think in this post-COVID reality, we're all a bit more aware, perhaps, of our environments than we were. I think it opens the door for a conversation in a way that can become more real. And look, I'm a recovering commercial real estate broker. I come from the sort of the old school real estate sector in some ways. And you're at a ULI event. I'm sure you're talking to some of these people. I've gone into rooms and I'll ask all the time, can I speak at an event where there's not going to be sustainability people there? Great. That's where I want to be. Right. And I'll get up there and I'll ask in this room of real estate folks, hey, does anyone understand, what scope 1, 2, or 3 emissions are? And a few years ago, I'd ask, does anyone understand what ESG is? And you get like 2 people in the back of the room that raise their hand nervously, but the reality is like, until we make it present for people, it just all sounds like stuff that's really not out there. But when we connect it to health and we connect it to the places where you live, people are like, oh, I do care about that. I would like to make a change,
Well, I can tell you, having come from this ULI meeting, and that's what I meant at the very beginning, by having a room full of people, quite large room, sticking around to speak to issues of community resilience, urban resilience, environmental resilience, and the value therein, the real value, meaning if you're a developer, do I have to take into account some of the difficulties that might be impacting my project because of climate change or other things? People are taking note of this. And so you're right. I see a lot more hands going up with people who understand the terms of engagement and what they want to do. But one last thing about buildings. It's often said that if there was ever a sector, a business sector that's been slow to move, it's been the construction or building sector.
Yeah.
I mean, we're still lifting heavy things and stacking them on top of one another. There's an aspect of building that I think forever will be medieval, right? It's a very physical enterprise. And technology doesn't always quite know how to make its way into this thing, but it seems to be happening. But when it comes to the actual buildings, which you declared at the beginning you're very interested in, talk about the actual building of the buildings and where you're seeing innovation happening in an industry that has not been noted for being that innovative.
Yeah, and look, I've had many conversations with people where we talk about the fact that much of construction has not changed in well over 100 years, if not longer. I think we're finally making some strides now when we look at what's happening right now around modular construction. Modular construction allows us to really control that construction environment, reduce a lot of waste out of that process, reduce a lot of the transportation costs to move materials to sites that aren't going to be used anyway or used efficiently. The whole movement around embodied carbon and materials transparency, really 5 years ago, it was kind of not a thing. And in the last 5 years, we've gotten to a place where, most architects who are in this space, most REITs who really care about sustainability are really looking at the embodied carbon of their materials, as well as GCs. And that stuff didn't even really exist 5 years ago. So we've come a long way, I think, in a relatively short period of time of shining a light on how our materials are being manufactured, the costs that go into it, the transportation costs to move that stuff around, and how do we be more efficient with that on site. I also think the other piece that's changing a little bit is, and this is probably going to get out there a little bit, but where I've seen digital twins and the use of AI start to be really impactful is when you're taking designs and when an architect's designing a building, they're actually plugging it into the community in that digital twin environment, in that simulated environment beforehand, and able to see the impacts on the community, able to see the ways that maybe they could reduce some of the impacts of the construction, improve how it connects with the community around it. And that's stuff that we couldn't do, even just a couple of years ago, in terms of looking at a building and how it plugs into a real live community. You can simulate a lot of that stuff now, which is pretty impressive.
And this is an interesting moment for that, in that architects, developers, owners, whoever it might be, are expecting to be asked these questions now, because it's part of the currency of conversations of speaking about buildings and cities. And those who are on the construction and or architecture side, they want to show what they can do, and they want to numerically demonstrate that the building I'm building or the community that I'm assembling has these attributes, and they're better for the environment, they're better for health and all kinds of other things. And so our ability to demonstrate what we're doing is becoming ever more efficient and effective. Mm-hmm. In California, you especially are asking for various disclosures, how people do business and how they go about this. Is California, and I think the answer is yes, but do you see California as the leader in this space? And how much further can what it's doing extend to the rest of the country?
Yeah, so this is really important. I think California has shown some important leadership in the last year. I'm specifically going to address, issues around scope 3 emissions and benchmarking. So, for the last probably 2 years or so, there's been some debate over having public companies disclose climate risk. What does that look like? How is that going to be handled? We finally got some clarity around that, and the SEC is requiring companies to start disclosing climate risk soon, but they're not going to have to include scope 3, emissions as part of that. The state of California passed a law last year where any company that does over $1 billion of revenue in California, so they don't have to necessarily be headquartered here, and there's a lot of companies that do $1 billion of revenue in California, are going to have to disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And those scope 3 emissions, for listeners, it's really the emissions that come from your supply chain. Right. And there's a lot of questions on how to define that and the different models to use for that. And that's that's fair. So California is going to start to require that. That's going to have a trickle down impact on other businesses, vendors, small to medium sized companies that I think we need to be prepared for. And then California has also done that around embodied carbon. Actually, it goes into effect in July of this year that any building over 100,000 feet is going to be required by CalGreen to have a life cycle cost analysis for that building. And there's a couple different pathways for compliance, but they're essentially getting you a place where you're actually thinking about and modeling what's the embodied carbon of that building. And those are important precedents, I think, that California has set, recently.
As it has for decades around automobile emissions and other things. And while, especially at this political moment, there's a lot of kicking and screaming about regulation and what states should be doing, what the Fed should be doing. And I can tell you, we've got all that going on here in Arizona. One thing that came up at the ULI conference around resilience also was building codes. That was almost universal interest in seeing problems addressed at the building code level. And surely you and the USGBC care passionately about that subject. What would you weigh in on with regard to about building codes?
Yeah, I think building codes are obviously clearly important, right? We need to that's kind of where we set the baseline of what happens in our buildings. I think, how do we address resilience is a complicated question, perhaps in code, right? In terms of how are we addressing heat? How are we addressing backup systems? And how are we addressing these other pieces? So I think we do need to continue to advocate to move code forward. And I don't think we spend enough time, frankly, trying to think about, and this is because I'm an econ major from undergrad, think about what's the ROI of these improvements? How are we selling this to developers, selling this to planners on, creating a better building that's going to have a higher long-term value. It's going to have a higher value for investors, for people, for renters, for tenants. And so being able to quantify the value, look, if you're moving into a building and you have awareness here in LA around the earthquake resiliency of that building, and you have visibility to that, well, that's going to factor into your decision. Same thing if you have visibility into the energy use of that building, you're going to be paying your energy bills. But we don't create transparency in great ways around this stuff. And I think we need to educate, frankly, developers, owners, architects, and others about how to communicate the value of these pieces, because oftentimes they'll try to do the right thing. And then they're like, oh, maybe I didn't get a higher return, or I didn't get the X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, how did you communicate that to the potential buyer? How did you communicate that to the renter? And they just expect the market to be aware. And so I think the code piece is important to set that baseline in terms of how we move forward, but it doesn't help us address the challenge with compliance and the challenge with people wanting to do these things willingly. So there's the carrot and the stick, right? We need to make sure we find that.
Although, Ben, I'm sure you would agree, there are those who are looking at the ROI, which has a recipe that looks like, get this thing built, get this leased up, and I'm getting out of it, right? And I'm selling it. And their interest in the long-term durability, sustainability, and usability of a building over time is, based on what I'm observing directly here, not part of the way they think about their business. And somehow, I'm not sure quite how we change that, but a lot of it has to do with housing. I see housing that's just inadequately built, and it's not built for the long haul the way, having just been in New York, you've seen some buildings that were designed to be community housing, so to speak, a century ago, and they're still serving that purpose famously well. I can see a lot here that's not going to survive that long. The topic of housing is so fraught right now. We clearly lack it in the quantities we need in this country. We have an unhoused population out there. So when you're trying to promote, let's say, decarbonization in housing, I'm sure you get some hand raised saying, hey, Ben, I just need to get a shelter over somebody's head. Yeah. And you're talking about these other, if you will, add-ons. I'm sure you have a solid answer for how to respond to that.
Well, there's two pieces here. So I want to address the first part here around sort of the buy and flip mindset, right? The build and flip, right? We're going to develop a building and we're going to flip it to a buyer. I question who's buying, who's not thinking long term about value. If you're buying, and I'll just use, if you're buying a building right now that's got a bunch of natural gas systems in it, and it's a relatively new building, and so you're paying a little bit of a premium because it's newer, your investors should be asking you, well, wait a minute, what are we doing? If this building's going to need us to have to pull out the combustion infrastructure, the gas infrastructure in the next 10 years, are we making a great decision on buying this asset? Are we taking into account the millions of dollars that need to be spent to convert that. And so I think the buying market, there's education also, and for investors, people are getting smarter about this kind of thing, but you really need to be thinking about the resilience of your asset and the future proofing of
Mm-hmm.
your asset. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's on the buying side. On the housing side, I would come back to some of the construction pieces we talked about earlier, in that the prices we're paying per square foot to build are absolutely ludicrous. When we've got housing challenges, we've got these other pieces. I would actually argue that looking at how to build sustainability is a great way to slash hundreds of dollars per square foot potentially out of that equation. And it's not, looking at a LEED certification is not going to help you address housing issues. But you know what? Looking at modular housing and
Mm-hmm.
looking at ways to reduce the amount of materials or the amount of labor that goes into building that building or building that home, that's going to help us address hundreds of dollars in that per square foot cost to build. Looking at how we engage more natural environments, more fresh air and things like that in the housing that we do build is going to
Mm-hmm.
help us better address mental health issues, long-term health impacts. So there's things that we can be thinking about that can help us reduce costs and help us create healthier communities, where if we just throw things up right now, and look, we've passed a lot of legislation in California to approve money for building affordable housing, but then you look at these costs for the housing, and we're talking, on the good side, maybe we're $500 to $600 a square foot, right? And on
Right.
the bad side, maybe we're $1,000 a square foot, because the cost of development has become so high in
Yeah.
the development process itself, and in the materials, and there's all these layers that have been added, and we need to
Right.
simplify. And that's taking a sustainable approach is about simplifying, taking a step back, and saying, okay, how do we use less materials? How do we do this faster? How do we do this in a way that's going to engage more of our environment?
So, in the time we have left, a couple final questions. You seem to care a lot, appropriately so, about workforce. And let's say
Mm-hmm.
people still are, they still are in the out of doors building things for us. And one, having the workforce to do that work is essential, but also how people get treated in that process. And we live in the hottest city in the United States. Every place is getting warmer, and there are places that have both heat and humidity, which is even more deadly, if you will. And I got to be, a little bit taken aback. I'm sure you are as well, by the recent bill that I think Governor DeSantis just signed, really forbidding the proper treatment of people who are doing this work outside. And we could get way deep into an argument about why you would even do such a thing. But talk to us about how the USGBC is not only thinking about the end product, the buildings themselves, but the workforce that helps to make this stuff happen.
No, it's a great question, and for us, I think that as USGBC California, that is, I think we've been trying to focus on, how do we create education, certifications, and other pieces that really empower folks that are part of the building supply chain, the building value chain, but maybe aren't the architects, engineers, or developers, but are the janitors, the landscapers, the tradespeople. We're actually launching an extreme heat
Mm-hmm.
certification for construction workers. In fact, our first class is this Thursday. And for us, we really saw an opportunity to connect with workers to make sure they understood this is the impacts of heat on your health as the worker.
Mm-hmm.
Here's things you can do to address that. Yes, that could be shading or hydration, or that could be a changing your work hours. That could be taking breaks at certain amount of times. Understanding what impacts heat for you as an individual when you're on site in terms of reflections and sunlight and these other pieces. And then helping people understand what types of materials reduce heat impacts, how building systems reduce heat impacts, how shading reduces heat impacts, and really empowering them that when they're working on a project, whether it's a retrofit of someone's garage into an ADU, or they're working on a commercial building, understanding how heat plays into that. I've been really amazed. Last year, one of the things I learned is that one of the highest rates of suicide is in the construction industry, and that
Hmm.
really blew me away. It's not something that we talk about or think about. We actually hosted some training last year on suicide prevention for construction workers, and this is a sector that deals with high heat,
Yep.
poor working conditions, a lot of noise, and is really kind of undervalued a lot of times. And so this is an area we want to bring more education to empower those folks, because once people learn something, they don't unlearn it. And so
Mm-hmm.
if we're having people on a job site learn about ways to reduce heat impacts for themselves and the buildings they're working on, they're not going to unlearn that over the course of their career.
You make it sound so logical, and yet here's someone promoting a bill in a state to forbid some of the logic that you just described. It's beyond comprehension. So, one last thing I want to talk to you about is water, given that we are both to some degree, dependent on the importation of water to our respective cities, LA, Phoenix. We could put a few others in there like Vegas and Denver and elsewhere, and that's the Colorado River. So I know that you address water at the even per person level in the construction of houses and neighborhoods and others. And you might want to mention a little bit of that and your 50L Home LA pilot project. But do you also get involved in the topic of water at the macro level? This is how it gets used in the house, but our dependence on these sources that are pretty fragile. Do you weigh in on those issues as well?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And look, water, I said at the beginning of this, I was sort of sustainability generalist he was a green building nerd. I'm just interested in so many things, and water has blown me away. The deeper I dive down into the water hole, I don't know if that's an accurate term or not, but the more fascinating is, especially here in the West, there's a great book called Cadillac Desert, which you've read, which is just it's a great listen. Also, if anyone's listening on this podcast, that really explains kind of the history of building infrastructure projects for water in the West. Here in California, we have over 400 different water agencies just in California. There's over 200 just in Southern California alone. And most of those, as is probably similar in Arizona, are working off of laws that in some cases are well over 100 years old. There's not really great management of a lot of these water agencies. As we're driving water efficiency, they're seeing less revenue, but being responsible for updating aging infrastructure and all those other things that maybe that investment in that infrastructure was done at a federal level 200 years ago, 150 years ago. And so we've got some big challenges there. And so we do advocate for water policy. I think, we've looked at ornamental turf here in California, and we'll be, removing that. I think you maybe have done some of that in Arizona, or that's being proposed. They've done that in Vegas already. So we need to really look at how we're using our water for irrigation. We know that roughly 60% of our water use goes to irrigation here in California. It's probably similar out there. And then we brought in a global coalition actually 2 years ago now, called the 50-Liter Home Initiative. So this is a group. It's Procter & Gamble, Electrolux, Kohler, IKEA, leading this group. It's out of the World Bank Sustainability Council. And they're focused on how can we reduce water use down to 50 liters per person per day. And as a frame of reference, we use 50 liters per person per day is about 13 gallons per person per day. Here in the LA area where I live, we use about 100 gallons per person per day. So we're talking about almost a tenth of our water use. And so what we did is we actually took 32 homes in the San Fernando Valley here. We retrofit them for point of use monitoring. And this data does not exist around water, which blew me away. There's no time of use, point of use data for water. So hot and cold water, every appliance, we're monitoring everything in these homes. We're getting over 2 million data points a month on water use. And 16 of those homes we retrofit with the latest and greatest products from those companies. So products from P&G, appliances from IKEA, Electrolux, new fixtures from Kohler, to see how far we could drop water use. We've already saved 30% of water use just by doing that. Then we're starting another phase this summer where we're taking the stuff that's in R&D, not quite in the market yet. So things like recirculating showers, things like nudging systems and smart home sensors. And we're going to be putting that stuff in to see how much further we can drop water use. One of the things that's blown me away around water is that most of the time there's not a holistic approach to water.
Right.
We might put in a new shower head. We might address our landscape, but very rarely does anyone do these things together. And what we found is by coming in and doing these improvements in the home, we're also doing monitoring of irrigation and have installed smart irrigation sensors, is that residents, because they're seeing the impacts in the home, started reducing their irrigation because they would realize, well, wait, I'm trying to save this water while I'm washing dishes, but I'm irrigating. Wait, that doesn't make sense. I'm irrigating my lawn. So they were creating this cultural change in the residents in these homes because it's a holistic approach, which again just hasn't ever been done on water. So it's been a great learning for us. I'm hoping we can launch some training around this later this year because it's something that's really needed. That's
why you're supposed to drag your dinner dishes out and put them on your artificial lawn and hose them down.
There we go.
It's just, so closing out, as I mentioned before, and maybe I was a little harsh on the governor of Florida, but what you're trying to do makes perfect sense to those of us who are in this business. I can tell you there are bills before our legislature here in Arizona that would make it impossible for, let's say, a state institution like university to participate in these kind of activities. It would astonish you at the language. So when you're trying to have ESG certifications for businesses that are doing the right thing and helping to contribute to the positive outcomes that you just described. It's a difficult time, right? And so, how do you conduct those conversations? What's the receptivity you're getting at the moment as we see some businesses and business leaders pulling back from what you and I might describe as what seems like a good and responsible approach to the built environment?
No, it's a great question, and look, I think we've all learned over the last few years that we have the ability to politicize anything in America. And what we saw happen around ESG over the last couple of years has been really fascinating. Something that started out as kind of a wonky term that people were using to address how they were looking at the environmental components of business became this completely politicized piece that now, in Florida, right, they're not allowed to have their fund invest in anything that has ESG even referenced. And I always come back to the end of the day, well, what do people really, really care about, right? And we as a society, we have a tendency to create labels, but what is at the end of the day, what is something like ESG? What are we really looking at? Well, we're trying to figure out how this business has less of an impact on the environment, and how do we break that down? Well, that's really about health. Sustainability is about health. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's health in your community, maybe it's health in someone else's community, but I think everyone can get on board with having a healthier lifestyle, having a healthy environment they can live in. All depends about how we frame it. So I come back to the real challenge for us in the sustainability movement is we need to communicate the ROI of what we're doing. We need to communicate to me, this has always been about, no, this is how we make more money long term. This is how we create, if we have a healthier society, then our healthcare costs are less. Mm-hmm. And we can do that by having buildings that maybe create a healthier environment. And guess what? We can spend money if people have jobs to do that. That's going to reduce our long-term costs. And so I'm an econ major by undergrad, from background. I love when we have that conversation, but I think that's the hard work we need to do, frankly, in the sustainability space, is address how does it make revenue? How does it produce an ROI? And if we can't figure that out, we need to keep working harder till we find it, right? But it's because we're not quantifying the health impacts. We're not quantifying the biodiversity impacts, right? We're not quantifying these other things.
Well, one of the things you said at the very beginning was that the secret sauce to getting people to come around, as you saw it, was that you and I are both in a place. We're both in a building. We're both in a community. And you can always bring people back home to that, literally and figuratively. And they understand when you're describing it in terms that seem to reflect their lives, you can win them over. I would tell you that the 10 Across Project focuses on just a particular piece of geography, pretty big one, from California to Florida. But simply by saying we're focused on this area, which we think is on the leading edge of a lot of these issues, it sort of snaps the idea into focus for people. Place really does matter, and people have been to places, they recognize that. And so I think we're both using the notion of place very effectively in that regard. The last thing I'll ask you, which we ask all 10 Across people, not only what you're going to do with the USGBC California going forward, but how far out there can you see in terms of your work and the effectiveness of it, the big change you think you're going to witness, your confidence in the future? When you're thinking in terms of years or decades or whatever it is, what's the metric you would use to describe the future you can confidently describe?
Well, the future is always unknown. That's part of the beauty of that. But I think my biggest mission, and this is a long-term goal of mine, and this comes from, like I said, I'm a recovering commercial real estate broker. I went to business school. Is I want to convey that the financial models we're using to value our real estate, to value these other pieces, they're flawed, right? We take these models that we build and we think that they're accurate. But the reality is the financial models we use for our buildings, right, for return on investment for development, they're not taking into account health impacts, not taking into account community impacts, not taking into account costs on the environment. And, all the models we use are flawed. We're on a journey to try to figure that out. And so when I look at, 5, 10, 20 years, first of all, we're short tens of thousands of jobs in California alone to modernize our buildings. There's investment on the table from the federal government and others that can help feed into that. What a great opportunity to use that money to create real jobs while we're reducing our long-term costs. And how do we flip that model a little bit? And I think some of that's happening. People have to disclose climate risk now. Well, what does that mean when you're a REIT? What does that mean if you're a publicly traded company? How many times have we had in the history of public companies where you've seen a major inflection point for how companies are valued climate risk is presenting part of that. We need to update those models. And so I think this movement around, you can call it ESG, you can call it climate risk. At the end of the day, these things are helping us sort of better perfect our financial models that we're using.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I think that's where I think 10 years from now, 20 years from now, people are going to look at a building and they're going to say, hey, what are the long-term energy costs of this building?
Right.
What is the value of the materials that are going into it? Because those things are going to help create the long-term value for that building itself, as opposed to just the rental stream, right? That's there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Ben, I can't thank you enough for these insights. And I sincerely hope that you are successful in making the case for an expanded definition of ROI, because I think you're absolutely right. And we're not factoring in a lot of crucial things that are going to mean a lot to future generations who should appropriately be asking, why weren't you thinking about these things?
Absolutely.
Let's hope we're not caught up in a bad way in that regard. Thank you so much, Ben. I really appreciate this. I hope it's not the last time we speak.
Yeah, I hope it's not either. And I want to say thank you for your time. And just, the last thing I'd want to say for your audience is that, look, we've all had the privilege of experiencing the world as it was. Mm-hmm. I think we all have sort of a profound responsibility to think about how do we carry that forward for the world that's going to be and provide something for not only our kids, but the generations to come. And look, every generation has their challenge. It comes in different ways, and this is part of ours. So hopefully I'll see you out there soon.